Hello everyone. Welcome you all to the global launch of AFWA's new report on gender-based violence in fast fashion supply chains during the COVID-19 pandemic. The report is titled as "A Stitch in Time Saved None." Before we start the event, I have a few tech announcements and general instructions for the participants. So there are 4 live language translations available in this event. When you join the event, please switch to the English channel and you prefer to hear in your native language. The languages available are Khmer, Bahasa, Urdu, and Sinhala. And in order to enable this language interpretation in your device, next slide. If you join from your laptop, you can see a globe icon at the bottom of your device. So please click on that and select the preferred language and enable it. Next. And if you join from your mobile, you can see 3 dots at the end of your device. Click on that and you can see an option, language interpretation, with a globe at the side of it. Click on that, select the preferred language and click done to enable it. We would like you to rename yourself once you join, your name and the organization you're from. And there are Q&A box and chat box available for the participants. So we will be taking questions after each panel through the Q&A box. And for any technical questions or assistance, you can type in your comments in chat box and our support team will be assisting you. This event is being live recorded and it is live streaming in YouTube. The link for our YouTube live streaming will be provided in the chat box, and you can also find us in YouTube under the name Asia Floor Wage Alliance. Please show some support on social media. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And finally, I would like to say that we want this to make a safe space for the victims and survivors of gender-based violence. Since it is a very sensitive topic, we encourage all of you to be very respectful to each other in the chat and Q&A box. Any disrespectful or vulgar comments will be deleted and the user will be removed from the meeting immediately. Likewise, please take this as a trigger warning for anyone who has experienced violence of any kind. If you feel unsafe or uncomfortable during the event, take your time and join us back later. And the PDF for the report will be shared in the chat box for the participants to access it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashika. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today from a number of countries across the globe for this event organized by Asia Floor Wage Alliance. Thank you very much for your support and enthusiasm in being here with us today. We warmly welcome you all to the launch of the Asia Floor Wage Alliance's report, A Stitch in Time Saved None, How Fashion Brands Fueled Violence in the Factory and Beyond, which sheds light on the implications of gender-based violence and harassment in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and how practices within garment supply chains impacted the violence and harassment that garment workers have had to face. As individuals that interact on a daily basis with people from varying backgrounds, I believe that we are all aware of the ever-present gender-based violence and harassment prevalent within our societies. In the apparel sector of garment-producing countries, where majority workers are women, gender-based violence and harassment is endemic, and women workers are faced with both physical and psychological violence and abuse. This is because of the continuous assault on workers' right to freedom of association within garment-producing hubs, leaving them without the most basic right to unionize. AFWA, along with its partners, have a long history of work in protecting the rights of women garment workers by addressing gender-based violence and harassment. We have been documenting and revealing instances of GBVH in the supply chains of prominent brands. And in 2018, we have released 3 publications that highlighted gender-based violence in the supply chains of these prominent brands. This report today continues in that tradition to look at how GBVH escalated as a result of the pandemic. In addressing gender-based violence and harassment, Asia Flow Wage Alliance believes in a ground-up approach which focuses on developing the leadership of women workers in the labor movement to identify, address, and remediate GBVH through strategies and mechanisms designed and implemented by them. Women trade union leaders of the Asia Flow Wage Alliance's Women's Leadership Committee, WLC, has also been working towards building labor power in the garment sector through women's trade union leadership. In a global industry like the garment sector, the WLC has been central to building power across borders through global organizing that better supports bargaining with employers and multinational brands by creating solidarity between workers. Working with WLC, AFWA has taken initiative to introduce the Safe Circle approach to ending gender-based violence and harassment in garment factories. This approach focuses on strengthening women workers' right to freedom of association so that they can act collectively to eradicate violence and harassment within their own production cycle through a bottom-up approach. The WLC has also played an important role in pushing for the ratification of the ILO C-190, which is an important way ahead in recognizing economic violence as a form of gender-based violence and harassment. And it also takes into account the ever-present issue of workplace violence and harassment against women. This also brings to light the importance of giving attention within this time period of the international campaign of 16 days of activism that calls for global actions to increase awareness, galvanize advocacy efforts, and share knowledge and innovations to eliminate all forms of violence against women, about these inequalities that women have to face within their workplace and homes. Today's launch will feature 2 panel discussions along the lines of addressing the realities of violence in fashion supply chains during the pandemic and with international perspectives on garment workers disrupting violence, which will be moderated by experts in their relevant fields. This report launch today is happening in the context where AFWA in July of this year launched the report titled Money Heist, COVID-19 Wage Theft in Global Garment Supply Chains, which looked at how brands conducted practices of wage theft during the pandemic, resulting in further exploitation of apparel sector workers. Following which, today's report launch will look into how this exploitation has been the root cause of violence and harassment prevalent in garment supply chains. The report was authored by Ananya Bhattacharjee, Viranta Ginting, Ashmita Sharma, Ashley Saxby, and Nivedita Jairam of Asia Flow Wage Alliance. Now I would like to invite Ashmita and Ashley to further present and discuss the findings of this report.
Hi, thanks, Vishmi. My name is Ashley from Asia Flow Wage Alliance, and Ashmita and myself, who are part of the writing team, will be presenting the research today. I hope you can hear me clearly. Yeah? Right, okay. Thanks, Rita. You can go to the next slide, please. So the research was carried out from April to August 2021 in collaboration with 23 trade unions and organizations across 6 countries, which are Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. The data is based on focus group discussions with 351 workers from 61 supplier factories and case studies with 68 women garment workers from 45 supplier factories. All of the factories were tier 1 suppliers from prominent manufacturing hubs located either in new or old industrial zones and were either closed or open during partial or complete lockdowns. The participants in FGDs and case studies were representative of different types of employment status, such as permanent, contract, daily wage, piece rate workers, as well as differing nature of contract, such as fixed term, short term, or monthly, and coming from different types of households, including single-headed households or joint households, or in employer-provided factory dorms or boarding houses, 15 trade union leaders from 5 countries were also interviewed. In the report, some major brand names are identified where workers shared their experiences of GBVH in supplier factories. However, certain brands have responded to instances of GBVH and begun dialogue and negotiations with AFWA to address the violence in specific supplier factories, with an expectation that such models can be replicated to instances in other countries and regions. So depending on how these brands act in accordance with their stated commitments in the coming weeks, we are prepared to launch a second report identifying all the names of major brands. Next slide, please, Rita. So the report looks at 2 main areas that have been underexplored with regard to the lived experiences of women garment workers and gender-based violence. Of course, we know that GBVH in its various forms was prevalent prior to the pandemic and is indeed part of the work process in supplier factories, used as a disciplinary tool to speed up the work process. So it was tragically predictable that this would increase during a time when work pressures were also increased. But given the widespread wage theft inflicted on workers during the pandemic and the fact that women were already disproportionately at poverty level, there's this economic aspect to the level of violence they experience, which is potentially less recognizable than the more overt or conspicuous forms of violence. And at the same time, the ILO's Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 identify economic harm as a form of GBVH, but there's no real definition. So we felt this was an important and timely concept to explore. And we elaborate on this by first looking at 4 key gender dimensions of wage theft. Second, by looking at restructuring of employment relationships, which mirrored patterns of discrimination based on multiple and intersecting oppressions. And third, what we call the garment industrial trauma complex, to signal the traumatizing effects of the verbal, physical, and sexual abuse, heightened health-related stress, and extreme, deep, economic-based anxiety in this industry that is fueled by extreme corporate greed. Second, we really wanted to stress how the purchasing practices of brands and their actions during the pandemic affected women workers in their homes and communities. This is because workers' experiences in the workplace also affect them in their homes, which has not been properly acknowledged. For example, we found that economic insecurity and increased work intensity led to increased incidences of domestic violence. And importantly, because domestic and care work disproportionately carried out by women is essential for the renewal and reproduction of workers who are the most vital component of production processes. While this work is essential to the global economy and makes immense economic contributions, this work is unrecognized, being either unpaid or underpaid. And during the pandemic, it was taken for granted that women would somehow compensate for the lack of employer-based social protection and public services during a time when new care work pressures were added to women's double burden, such as increased healthcare and childcare responsibilities. Next slide, please. So the report makes 3 important arguments. First, global apparel brands depend on and profit from women's secondary status in society, and in doing so, reinforce discriminatory social norms that led to women workers being disproportionately impacted during the pandemic. Second, different forms of GBVH experienced by women workers, which were exacerbated during the pandemic, correspond to the needs of production. Actually, it is the business models embedded in global supply chains that create the conditions for GBVH, experienced not only in the factory, but also in women's homes and communities. Third, women workers actually subsidized global apparel brands during the pandemic, not only through wage theft, but also through social reproduction of the workforce at great personal cost, including the degradation of their bodies and mental well-being. And these amount to what we call the feminization of the COVID-19 crisis. Next slide, please, and I will hand it over to Ashmita Sharma.
Thank you, Ashley. Hello, everyone. I'll proceed further. There are several important findings. And there are several important findings, and we've taken a feminist lens in analyzing them. Of course, our findings confirm what other studies have found, that GBVH is endemic to the industry and was worsened under the pandemic. We will highlight some of the most striking findings here. First and importantly, wage theft committed by brands during the pandemic disproportionately impacted women workers in their supply chains. For example, we saw that suppliers leveraged this pre-existing gender pay gap to their advantage by keeping lower paid women workers employed during lockdown periods while men were laid off. But post-lockdown, men were more likely to be rehired. Also, women's income remained persistently low through the year, while male workers' income gradually improved to pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2020. Suppliers also dramatically downsized the workforce because of brands' unilateral cost cutting. This was done through a number of tactics, many of which were blatantly illegal, like firing workers for refusing to work overtime or demanding payment for overtime, firing workers for taking leave, forcing permanent workers to resign and rejoin as new employees, threatening to withhold severance pay unless workers voluntarily resign, terminating union organizers or workers who were involved in protests or union activities. There were also tactics suppliers used, like setting impossibly high targets and firing workers when they didn't meet them, eliminating employer-provided transportation so that workers are unable to come to work or arrive late so that they are fired, refusing to pay for COVID-19 testing, and terminating workers who show symptoms, and verbally abusing and deriding workers until they voluntarily resign. We also found that many pregnant women across countries were terminated or forced to resign after the factory refused to reopen creches. Next slide, please. Even if you're allowed to break for 30 minutes for lunch, we have to work for an extra 30 minutes without pay to make up for the loss to the company. Such long hours of work without rest is extremely stressful to the mind and the body, said Manju Devi, a garment worker from India. Next slide, please. We also found that as the size of the workforce was reduced, this meant that fewer workers had to work harder and longer to meet production targets. Post-unpaid overtime was a primary means to squeeze more work out of fewer workers, with the workday being extended an average of 2 hours, while in some extreme cases, workers reported being forced to work overnight. Workers also became responsible for more than one task and were prevented from taking legally mandated breaks and leaves, even from taking bathroom breaks. Next slide, please. The factory gives us cloth masks even now with the spread of COVID-19. I have myself requested a proper mask, but they still give us cloth masks. The cloth used for the mask comes from the cutting section. Workers in the cutting department had tested positive for corona a few days back. Now the other workers are touching what those workers have been touching. The tailors touch them. They don't have a proper mask, no gloves, shared by Nimali, a worker from Sri Lanka. Next slide, please. Workers were at high risk of exposure to the COVID-19 virus. There were reports that if employers originally observed health protocols, they stopped doing so after a period of time. Overwork without time for adequate rest, unhygienic toilets, overcrowding in company-provided buses and public buses, and at entryways and in canteens, poor air circulation and high temperatures, lack of proper distancing between workstations, thumbprint scanners that are not properly disinfected, and invasive security checks from security officers who do not observe proper health protocols. These were common complaints from workers who felt they were at high risk of contracting the virus. Next slide, please. Oh God, put me to death. If suicide is not a great sin, I would do that, said Sumaya, a garment worker from Ghazipur, Bangladesh, sharing about the anguish she experienced from constant abuse she suffered due to work pressure, domestic violence, and verbal abuse. Stories like Sumaya's represent one of the most prominent and troubling findings, the effects on mental health. Depression, stress, and anxiety, and even suicidal ideation were very common amongst garment workers as a direct result of increased work intensity, the associated rise in GBVH, and the virus itself. There was also a strong association between mental stress and economic harm. Respondents reported that they felt powerless with very little control over their lives because of their dependence on low-wage jobs. Wage theft not only causes stress due to economic insecurity, unpaid wages have the effect of making their hard work invisible and unrecognized, similar to how their unpaid work in the home is not recognized even though their work in the factory and home fuels the lucrative global garment industry. Meanwhile, they have to navigate systems of unequal power and gender domination through different stages: youth, pregnancy, motherhood, marital status, which are leveraged against them to deny them basic justice and job security. And their bodies face gendered violence in production lines and during commutes, and they're stripped of their basic selfhood and dignity through
Shmita,
incessant.
I'm so sorry to cut you. It's just that the interpreters are having a hard time to translate. Can you go a little bit slower?
Okay, sure.
Thank you so much.
And their bodies face gendered violence in production lines and during commutes, and they are stripped of their basic selfhood and dignity through incessant physical and verbal abuse. All of this amounts to nothing less than trauma, and it is carried in the body and mind long term. So we use the term embodied trauma to convey this. Next slide, please. Importantly, we also saw how economic harm imposed by brands led to a ripple effect of different forms of violence experienced by women workers in their homes, families, and communities. This is quite a unique aspect of the report, as these have usually received less attention in connection with the purchasing practices of brands. Several women noted how long working hours and forced unpaid overtime during the pandemic led to disharmony in families, intensifying instances of domestic violence. The managers give us high production targets, which we cannot complete in 8 hours. Then they curse and yell at us. They make us do overtime work but refuse to record it and refuse to pay us for it. I would be delayed in reaching home due to this unrecorded overtime, and my husband would yell at me, asking me why I'm late and who I was with. My husband is always angry and abusive when I stay back to do overtime work. If I refuse to do overtime work, the managers abuse me. If I do overtime work, my husband abuses me. This was shared by Sarita, a garment worker from a supply factory in Bengaluru, India. Can you go back to the previous slide, please? In addition, we look at the home, not only in terms of the familial homes, but also for migrant women workers who live in factory dorms and boarding houses. In these types of living arrangements, we saw gendered forms of violence perpetrated by employers, landlords, and shopkeepers. For example, Chana, a garment worker from Gurgaon, India, shared how when her factory shut down, she had difficulty paying rent. The landlord of our boarding house would constantly harass her, threatening to evict her and call her names, even barging into her room when she was getting dressed. This was also highlighted in AFWA's Money Heist report that women were forced to reduce their consumption, take on huge debts, and sell their assets, leading to hunger, malnutrition, and bodily neglect, which also meant that women were more susceptible to contracting the virus due to weakened immune systems. Women across countries also reported that reduced income resulted in foregoing medical treatment and buying medicines. I believe that is our time. The report includes several quotes, stories from women garment workers sharing their experiences of struggle, hardships, and stories of gender-based violence and harassment in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has been a humbling experience and at times infuriating to know what these women have had to endure because of corporate greed. These women bravely shared their experiences with the research team, for which we are grateful and inspired by their resilience. We hope you will take the time to read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley and Ashmita. We are now moving on to the first panel of the report launch, which focuses on the violence in fashion supply chains during the pandemic. The panel will be moderated by Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura. Kanchana Ruwanpura is a professor at the University of Gothenburg. Her research interests and areas of specialization include labor geographies, feminism and gender, conflict and post-conflict development politics, ethical trading and global governance, broadly focusing on the South Asian region. Now, I would like to invite Professor Kanchana to moderate the first panel of today's event.
Thanks a lot, Vishmi. Thanks to all the AFWA colleagues for inviting me and having me here. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's such an honor to do this. And I'm glad I was picked, but I'm doing this with, I've worked together with this on Adra Surendran, who can't be here. So our first panel is, as Vishmi said, telling our truths, violence in fashion supply chains during the pandemic. So we have three speakers today, I'll give a quick bio of each of them. Zahra Khan, who is the founding general secretary of the Home-Based Women Workers Federation, which is the first trade union of women workers, or especially home-based workers in Pakistan. HBWWF have played an extremely important role in helping pass the Home-Based Workers Act of 2017 in Sindh, Pakistan, which was one of the first pieces of legislation that was recognized and accepted the rights of home-based workers in Pakistan, but also more generally for South Asia. She's a member of many of the tripartite committees in Pakistan, including the Sindh Minimum Wage Board, the Sindh Tripartite Labour Standing Committee, and the Sindh Occupational and Health Council, and obviously also the Sindh Home-Based Workers Governing Body. Our next speaker comes from Indonesia. She is Sumianti, who is the chair of the National Committee for Women and Children in the Central Executive Board of the National Labour Union. And I'll give a take on saying something in Bahasa Indonesian, which is Serikat Perkaj Nasional, if I got that correct. She has organized and led dozens of workplace and community campaigns against global fashion brands, and has organized at the intersection of gender, migration, and forced labor. She's trained as a lawyer and has held many positions, including the position of the National Women's Committee at the Confederation of Indonesian Women Workers Union. Our final speaker is Nazreen Begum, who is the coordinator of capacity building at the Bangladeshi Nari Pragati Sangha, which is a women's organization in Bangladesh. And they have been working for the past 3 decades at the intersection of gender and labor rights. Nazreen has worked as an educator, development practitioner, and project coordinator, focusing on gender, intersectionality, and capitalism, or the capitalist process that all of us kind of live through and live with. Nazreen has more than 18 years of experience in organizing, managing, and running gender and sexual health training programs with various civil society organizations and educational institutions in Bangladesh. Her advocacy on gender has involved working with diverse women's groups in Bangladesh, like garment sector workers, trafficked women, and women's microfinance groups. So those are our 3 panelists. So in terms of what we are hoping to cover in this section, in this panel, when Adra and I were reading through a draft of the report, we were struck by how frequently the tensions between wages, the lack of living wages, and different forms of gender-based violence seems to emanate over time. And these debates actually go as far back as Marx's own writing about hidden abodes or even Engels. But in more recent contemporary times, it goes back to the 1970s when feminist scholars or feminist economists really, but also feminist scholars like Jane Humphreys, Michelle Barrett were looking at British industrial history and arguing about the centrality of family wages to lift working class families out of poverty. The framing of family wages is actually in today's context what we call living wages, and that is the crux of the issue. That during the pandemic, what we have seen is a fall in wages which were never living wages in the first place, and how this has exacerbated tensions for communities, for working class communities and women workers, both within factories and outside factories in the community. So the best quote from Ashmita's was really captured by Sarita from Bengalaru, where she talks about how she's caught between the harassment and the violence of her supervisors, as well as that of her own spouse or her community. I recognize, as somebody who's worked primarily in Sri Lanka, there are variations within these countries, but nonetheless, the overarching theme of difficulties that women workers have faced during the pandemic, and the pandemic has only accentuated this.
Anjana?
So yeah, without talking any further, yeah, am I talking too fast?
Yeah, a little fast. The
Okay, really
Bahasa
sorry.
is finding it hard.
Okay, really sorry. I will slow down now.
Thank you.
So anyway, in terms of what we will cover, we will organize it with 3 broad questions, giving some of these panelists to speak a little bit more detail of the evidence they have gathered their own experiences. So the very first question I'm going to pose to Zahra actually is, gender-based violence, of course, has always existed in fashion supply chains. However, our sense from reading the report is that it seems to have changed its form and intensity during the pandemic. So we want to know, what has she been hearing from the workers and organizers regarding this continuum or regarding this relationship? Zahra, over to you.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for having me on this session, very important session.
Sarah, we request you to turn your video on so that.
Yeah, but there is a internet issue.
Okay.
So maybe I think, okay.
It's not an issue, Zara. You can go ahead.
Okay, fine. Because I'm not able to open it. Sorry for bad in technology. Okay. During pandemic, unemployment increased many-fold in Pakistan. 3 out of 4 people lost their livelihood. According to CCC's one report, that 2.2 million workers are from the textile and garment sector who lost their job in Pakistan. It directly not only adversely economic condition, but also badly damaged social fabric of working class localities. At home, violence against especially unemployed women workers increased rapidly. More girls were withdrawn from educational institution as compared to boys because of family didn't have money to pay fees. Domestic and day work for women was also increased. Many women workers have lost their job because majority of them were hired under the third-party contract system. That's why women were most affected one in the COVID. During lockdown, women were unable to reach their workplaces. I know one factory where transport facility was not given to 200 women workers by the management, so they didn't get paid and lost their job. But the other thing was that factory has provided the same facility to the male workers. So this is the discrimination we found there. We have many evidence where workers have been fired without getting their legal dues, bonus, provident fund or gratuity, and they have been working in those factories over the last 15 to 20 years. So they literally were crying, and we have videos of those women workers from many factories. The fear of unemployment at the workplace has also made women more vulnerable to physical and sexual harassment. And you know that during pandemic and before the pandemic, because we have the IMF policies adopted by our government, so the informalization is increasing. Even now, the formal pace, like the factory is becoming informalized. Many workers hired on third-party contract system, they are not get an appointment letter from the management. Even they are not even paid the minimum wage, which is 17,500. It is increased now. It's 20, but the employers were in court against this notification. So we are fighting for that as well. So these are the conditions which women face in Pakistan during the lockdown.
Thanks, Zahra, and thanks for also keeping within time, which is great. So this gives us a little bit more time to discuss with Sumi, who is our next speaker. So one of the things when both Adra and I were reading the report was that it extensively talks about the gendered impacts of wage theft on garment workers. And this is attributed to the unfair purchasing practices of fashion brands. And so to Sumi, to whom I will give 5 minutes, I just wondered if you can tell the audience, give us a little bit more detail in that how women workers felt that the loss of wages is a form of violence inflicted on them. Do they believe that wage theft practices of brands and suppliers during the pandemic have made women workers more vulnerable to the wide spectrum of violence, which will include from verbal violence or verbal shouting to sexual harassment? And how does this kind of percolate from within the factory to outside of the factory? Sumi, over to you. You have something like 5 minutes, Sumi. I hope I spoke slowly and you could understand the question.
Baik, terima kasih. Selamat malam waktu Indonesia kepada semuanya. Di saat pandemi itu, saya melihat bahwa banyak terjadi pengurangan upah. Pengurangan upah ini menurut saya ini menjadi sebuah perilaku atau tindakan yang tidak bisa terima, baik sekali atau berulang. Karena ini berdampak kepada pengurangan terhadap ini pendapatan rutin mereka. Sementara pendapatan rutin mereka itu kan untuk pemenuhan kebutuhan gizi keluarga. Saat pandemi gizi keluarga
Sumi,
harus...
can I stop you for a second, please? Yuli, can you please come to English channel and help? Help with the translation. Okay, you can speak as Sumi is speaking. We'll be able to hear you. You just need to be on English channel.
Oke, lanjut.
Yeah, you can. Can you give her a second to just translate what you just said? Yeah. Yuli, over to you. And Sumi, yes. Yeah,
Saya
you speak. Yeah. Yeah.
udah bisa mulai? Ya, saya menganggap bahwa pengurangan upah yang terjadi pada saat pandemi ini yang dilakukan oleh para pengusaha ini menjadi bagian dari sebuah perilaku atau tindakan yang tidak bisa diterima, baik itu sekali terjadi atau berulang, karena ini berdampak kepada pendapatan rutin. Sementara pendapatan rutin itu dibutuhkan untuk pemenuhan kebutuhan gizi keluarga, gitu. Di mana saat pandemi kebutuhan gizi ini kan jadi meningkat karena dia harus meningkatkan kondisi badannya, dia harus pemenuhan gizi tersebut untuk memenuhi semua kebutuhan keluarga. Nah, pemenuhan gizi keluarga ini kan menjadi kebutuhan dasar ya, kebutuhan pangan. Bisa diikutin sama Yuli, saya nggak dengar suara Yuli soalnya, menerjemahkan. Oke. Ya. Seperti kita tahu bahwa pendapatan rutin kan itu untuk memenuhi kebutuhan gizi keluarga, di mana perempuan pada saat pandemi kan dia harus berjuang untuk memenuhi gizi keluarga terpenuhi agar di saat pandemi ini mereka bisa survive. Nah, persoalannya ketika gaji ini dikurangi, otomatis kan ini dia harus berusaha untuk memenuhi kebutuhan dasar. baik pangan maupun papannya. Gitu. Nah, persoalannya pengurangan upah ini kan terkait dengan berkurangnya waktu dan dianggap berkurangnya tentang dan berkurangnya hasil kerja itu kan membuat akhirnya berpotensi terjadi kekerasan-kekerasan lainnya. Kalau tadi bicara pengurangan upah berdampak kepada pengurangan pemenuhan kebutuhan rutin, kebutuhan gizi keluarga, itu berdampak kepada ekonomi tentunya kan. Tapi ini juga bisa menjadi luas. Kemudian dia juga bisa menjadi karena tekanan hidup semakin tinggi, pemenuhan gizi juga harus semakin dia bisa mencari tambahan di luar sana. Sehingga kan ketika di rumah dia interaksi dengan suami juga semakin lebih tinggi karena sering waktunya akan sering kan di rumah gitu. Nah, interaksi ini kan akan menimbulkan tekanan-tekanan, bisa saja terjadi perbedaan pendapat di rumah tangga dalam mengasuh anak atau misalnya dalam memenuhi gizi karena kan kita tahu berkurangnya pendapatan akhirnya ekstra harus pengaturan ekonomi keluarga lagi. Aku nggak dengar Yuli soalnya, jadi aku nggak bisa menyesuaikan ngomongnya. Oke, bisa dilanjutkan? Ya. Nah, artinya gesekan yang terjadi karena interaksi antara misalnya suami dengan istri, dengan anak lebih sering di rumah, mereka keadaan tertekan, kemudian bisa saja terjadi perbedaan pendapat dan itu meningkatkan kekerasan, seperti juga bisa saja terjadi kekerasan psikis ya, karena akhirnya istri harus mengalah dengan pendapat suami, istri selalu disalahkan, sehingga kan itu bisa saja terjadi tekanan-tekanan, membuat tekanan fisik kepada si istri, bisa jadi bahkan lebih parah dari itu, bisa terjadi tekanan juga kekerasan fisik gitu, selain psikis, fisik juga bisa terjadi. Bahkan mungkin ketika dia harus memenuhi kebutuhan gizi keluarga, akhirnya dia harus berhutang ke pihak lain. Contoh misalnya kemudian dia harus terlilit oleh rentenir. Ya, akhirnya banyak kekerasan yang bisa dia alami pada saat pandemi ini. Yang seperti saya tadi sampaikan, selain kekerasan ekonomi, kekerasan psikis, kekerasan fisik mungkin juga terjadi, bisa saja juga terjadi kekerasan seksual kalau kondisinya memang akan melibatkan banyak pihak yang karena untuk memenuhi kebutuhan gizi tadi. Nah, terus terkait dengan tentang kekerasan ini yang kemudian makin meluas dan baik di dalam pabrik maupun di luar pabrik, ini juga kan akhirnya akan berdampak karena si perusahaan juga kan tidak mau bertanggung jawab dengan apa yang terjadi. Dia merasa juga dia harus melakukan protokol kesehatan, dia harus mengurangi jam operasionalnya, kemudian dia juga harus mengalami order yang berkurang sehingga dia nggak mau bertanggung jawab dengan keadaan atau kondisi pekerja. Ini persoalan baru lagi. Sisi lain, hal itu kan akan berdampak ketika bisa diikutin nggak? Yuli bisa ngikutin saya nggak? Nah, kondisi kekerasan di dalam pabrik selama ini kan itu terjadi tentang adanya pengurangan jam kerja, kemudian karena pemerintah melakukan pembatasan ruang gerak masyarakat, pengusaha juga harus mengurangi jam-jam operasionalnya, maka terjadi perusahaan mengatur rekayasa jam kerja. Ada beberapa perusahaan yang memang mengurangi jam kerjanya, tapi ada juga yang melakukan kemudian dia melakukan shift panjang gitu, long shift dua perpanjangan shift ya, yang harusnya satu shift 7 jam misalnya kalau di Indonesia ini menjadi 2 jam sekaligus.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to intervene, but we are running short of time.
Okay, so thanks Sumi for the intervention.
Okay.
We can come back to Sumi during the question and answer session if there's time. I realized there might have been an issue with the translation, so I'll quickly try and summarize what has been sent to me in terms of what Sumi said. But it is also on the chat box if you all want. Sumi essentially mentioned that eliminating wages from the workers' point of view, is an unacceptable behavior and practice. And when it's done repeatedly, it affects the workers' income. And of course, it has a big impact on the standard of living. And in this regard, it is a form of economic violence because wages are a benchmark for women workers to fulfill their basic needs, to obtain basic services such as food, clothing for daily use, including for their family members. So, most of these workers are not really asking for what is unreasonable request. She also went on to say that loss of wages for time and work results has the potential to cause other forms of violence, such as domestic violence, but also mental distress, and in this regard, mental violence, because they have to be dealing with debt collectors, and this causes a lot of anxiety. And this is like the essence of what Sumi was talking about. And then she wrapped up by saying the company is not responsible for reasons of losing orders or reasons for the government regulations to limit operations. She places the responsibility on the brands and buyers because they don't seem to have any interest in wanting to know the conditions of the company, especially that of the workers. I think that would about summarize some of what Sumi said, and apologies, it's technology. This kind of thing happens in every session or in all sessions. So we'll now go to the next set of questions, the next set of questions, which Nazreen will respond to. So the report indicates that the COVID-19 pandemic and the violence that workers are experiencing during it, including the loss of wages, has had a severe mental health impact, which is something that Sumi brought up as well. Women workers across government-producing countries have spoken about dealing with depression or suicidal thoughts or attempting it, especially as a result of the pandemic or having to work through the pandemic. Most of them have not been able to seek help. And so we are hoping that Nazreen would shed us a little bit more light on what she thinks are the factors that contribute to it. And Nazreen, you have something like 4 minutes for this to respond. And thank you for patiently waiting till I summarize Sumi's thing as well. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. I listening the previous panel discussion. I think this is very important issue. Already the report published that garments industrial trauma complex, one of the dimension, but this situation is come up not only jobless situation in pandemic, but also I include here gender dimension is very much important in this traumatized situation. Mental health situation is decreased the both of the worker, male and female, but the female worker are traumatized, all their anxiety, they are restless, they are stressed, not only jobless situation, but also the GBB factor is very much important in this pandemic situation, as well as double burden of work in household and also in factory. Those factor situation is decrease the mental situation. And I want to say some verbal and emotional abuse in Bangladesh are always occurring in the factory. Actually swearing, shouting, making fun of sexual stories. This is the sexual harassment. Rape case or physically assault reported very poorly, but always we see in the factory level sexual harassment, refused by an officer to give overtime to a female worker for not agreement of an incident proposal. But also we see touching any part of the body female worker is insulting. This situation always affect the mental health of a female worker. So when we address the mental situation or mental risks, we not only introduce this sexual harassment situation, we only related jobless situation, low wage, but I want to say in Bangladesh situation, GBP is one of the dimension that female worker always feel stress, anxieties, and this is the high risks of mental health. In our country, the physical health and well-being is addressed in factory, but mental health is not addressed. So this is very much important to address the mental health and also the support, psychosocial support for survivors. We give legal support. We want to give well-being support, but we cannot any mechanism to address mental health. So I want to suggest in this pandemic situation, we look that mental anxiety is very much important for female worker. This actually reduces the productivity and the enable environment, working environment of the factory is very much important in this issue. In order to improve the mental health and well-being of female garment worker, steps should be taken actually in to active the sexual harassment committee. In our country, High Court the verdict address some of the sexual harassment, the behavior addressed as a sexual harassment. So every factory need a committee to prevent this survivor support. So it important not only the active the committee, but also the psychosocial support or counseling support in the factory is very much important. So in this context, I want to say every factory need an enable environment and the support, not medical treatment, but also psychosocial and counseling support in the factory.
Thank you, Nazreen. Nazreen actually raised a very important point, because one of the things when I do research is, health and safety is considered very important in factory settings. And yet there's a very narrow understanding of it. And Nazreen actually has highlighted that workers' well-being is also something that one needs to be concerned about when we are looking at women workers. And perhaps the pandemic has just really accentuated the need for it. The report, and I'm now shifting back to one of the final points in this panel. The report really mostly focuses on gender-based violence inflicted on formal garment workers, mostly in Tier 1 factories. We know, of course, that informality has accentuated in this period, but also what it means, it worsens the risks of gender-based violence. So I'm going back to Zehra because she's a representative of a home workers union for Pakistan, so that in the hope that she can tell us a little bit more about how the pandemic affected women home workers, and if any of the purchasing practices of brands has played a role in increasing the vulnerability of women home workers to gender-based violence. And this is Zehra would be finishing up. Zehra has 3 minutes, Zehra, for this, and then we open it up for question and answers for 5 minutes. Yeah, thank you, Zehra.
Okay. Okay, thank you. See, the main thing is to understand that the informal work is linked with the formal work. When the work in the factories stop, so automatically the work of home-based workers also stop. So we can say that the COVID has had a huge impact on the informal workers, especially on home-based workers who comes at the end of the supply chain, as their employers are not visible, very much visible, and the brand are least concerned about exploitation in whole supply chain or even think about the home-based workers. As I said, uh, as I said that market was completely closed during the COVID, so the work was stopped completely for them. No home-based workers had worked during the lockdown because of their visibility in the supply chain. Still worker don't have the regular work. Despite of that, this is the season of work, and sale as well. Local market takes it whole year consumption during these years, but they don't have any proper work. Even home-based worker didn't get paid for the completed work and are still waiting to get a full payment from their employers, who are mainly contractors or middlemen. So these things create many problems for these home-based workers. Still, the situation is not very good, as wages for the same work has been reduced. Now they are getting more or less wages than for the same work, and their male. And the second thing was that during the COVID, their male partners don't have job or lost their job, and even they didn't get their full payment or dues from the factories. So this has increased workers, especially women workers, anxiety and helplessness because the need was not being met. So in the society, the all anger release on those who are the weakest in the society, and they are the women and the children. Therefore, the ratio of violence increased. And the violence was not just physical, it was psychological as well, as many uh, some of you have already talking about it, and even the health, you have also talked about the health issues as well. There is an economic crisis, but it was not convert. This is the fact that this is the economic crisis, and we all are facing, even the whole world is facing this issue. But the problem is that this crisis was not converted into the movement. As you know, we have less than 1% workers organizing the trade union, and women, we don't know about the percentages of the women, how women are engaged with the trade union. So women suffered a lot, and majority women are not the part of any union. But the main thing which we have to discuss here is that the COVID brand miserably failed to protect workers' livelihood and didn't show um any concrete program to compensate worker in their whole supply chain.
Okay, Zahra, thanks a lot.
Hello, uh, hello. Sorry. So that's why I think it is a need to extensive discourse on the gender-based violence and harassment, even also on the compliances, universalization of social security scheme, and every worker, uh, whether their employer are visible or not, they should registered with the social security scheme and pension scheme. And we need that kind of a binding and mandatory legislation, treaty or agreement to protect workers' right, and along with strong but easy or approachable monitoring system with workers representative in it. So that's how we can, I think, we can resolve these issues. We don't have the complaint mechanism, the proper complaint mechanism. So many times women face trouble if or think that if she go for to launch any complaint, even in the factory or with the labor department or in the court, then she will be treated very badly within the factory and even in the home as well. So this is the main thing which we have to look into it, that how we can solve or how can we get the payment, full payment for these home-based workers, and even for the factory workers, especially the women workers who are working since
Okay.
or for last 5 or 6 years.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Zahra. So I think we may be a little bit tight for time. We were supposed to have 5 minutes for questions, but there are really two main questions here. Unless either Zahra Zahra actually has answered one of the questions, either Nazreen or Sumyati wants to answer these questions, they can do so. Otherwise, we can move on to the next panel. The two questions there are, and I find the second one quite interesting. Gaye Yilmaz, if I'm pronouncing the name right, says, these harsh conditions of women workers exist only in fashion supply chains, or do they also exist in the entire clothing industry, including where local firms do apparel production, but with no connections to brands? I think this is an important one because it raises questions about the nature of capitalism, which is not just about the brands, but also other employers. But in the interest of time, unless somebody thinks we really need to address this, I will let Abida take over for the next panel, if I think correctly. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kanchana, and also to the various perspectives from our distinguished speakers. This also goes on to show that regardless of geographical differences, violence continues to take very similar forms. Our second panel for today will discuss the international perspectives on garment workers disrupting violence and its implications on the violence and harassment in the workplace and at home. The panel will be moderated by Nivedita Jairam, the Asia Coordinator for Labor Rights at Asia Flow Wage Alliance.
Thank you, Vishmi, and thanks to the previous panel who've done an excellent job of highlighting for us the extent and nature of GBVH faced by women workers in fashion supply chains, which was escalated as a result of the extreme economic violence that they faced during the pandemic. These discussions have really brought forth the urgent need for solutions that identify, address, and remediate GBVH across fashion supply chains. And it's shown us why it is so important that these solutions be designed and implemented through consultations with women workers and their trade unions. In this panel, women leaders from the labor movement in Asia will tell us about their perspectives and important efforts that they've been taking to effect change at all levels, from grassroots action to policy shifts to end GBVH in fashion supply chains. I'll now introduce the three speakers that we have for this panel. We have Ashila Niroshin Dandaniya Gamage. She is the General Secretary of Stand Up Lanka, one of the very few unions that organize women garment workers in the free trade zones of Sri Lanka. Ashila, who worked in garment factories in Sri Lanka and Jordan, is a labor and migrant rights campaigner and organizer with more than 20 years of organizing experience. Her work focuses on ensuring that worker rights are part of policy discussions for national development. She has wide experience in implementing programs for fostering gender equality, ending gender-based violence, and advancing the rights of unprotected and marginalized workers. We also have with us Divya Rakhini. She is the state president of the Tamil Nadu Textile and Common Labor Union, the only Dalit women-led textile workers union in the state of Tamil Nadu in India. She's a longtime trade unionist, educator, and feminist campaigner who has worked extensively for the rights of textile and garment workers, particularly from the Dalit community in Tamil Nadu. She has worked on building strong partnerships between labor and community organizations and has led numerous campaigns at the intersection of caste, gender-based justice, migration, and labor rights. We also have with us Yang Soporn. She is the president of the Cambodian Alliance of Trade Unions. She started her career working in a garment factory and has worked extensively to empower, organize, and strengthen garment workers and other low-income communities and vulnerable populations. She has more than 20 years of experience as a labor organizer and social justice advocate and has been promoting long-term change in policy and corporate practices to prevent all forms of labor and gender exploitation. We'll begin with the discussion now. I just want to remind speakers that you have 5 minutes to speak. And my first question is for you, Ashila. The report suggests that ensuring living wages. Yeah, so my question is for you, Ashila. I'll repeat. The report suggests that ensuring living wages for garment workers is an important means to prevent, address, and remediate gender-based violence in fashion supply chains. Can you explain why living wages are not just an important means for women's empowerment, but also to end all forms of gender-based violence?
ඇත්ත වශයෙන්ම අපි දන්නවා කාන්තාවන්ගේ ඇත්ත සවිබල ගැනීමක් කිසිසේත්ම සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඔවුන්ට ජීවත් වීමට සරලම වැටුපක් ලැබෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඒ කියන ඕනම සේවකයෙක්ගෙන් ඇහුවොත් කියනවා ඇත්ත වශයෙන්ම මේක ඒ විදිහට තමයි සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ. අපි හැමෝම දන්නවා ඕනම කෙනෙක්ගේ ලිවිං ස්ටෑන්ඩඩ් රඳා දැන් කියද දැන් කියද hello දැන් එනවද හරි අත වශයෙන්ම කාන්තාවන්ගේ ඇත්ත සොයබල ගැනීමක් කිසිසේත්ම සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඔවුන්ට ජීවත් වීමට සරලම වැටුපක් ලැබෙන්නේ නැති. ඒ ගැන ඕනම සේවකයෙක්ගෙන් අහුවොත් ඔවුන් පිළිතුරු දෙන්නේ ඒ විදිහට තමයි. අපි හැමෝම දන්නවා ඕනම කෙනෙක්ගේ ලිවිං ස්ටෑන්ඩඩ් රඳා පවතින හා තීරණය වෙන්නේ උන්ගේ අතේ පවතින මුදලක් එක්ක. තමන්ගේ ක්‍රය ශක්තියත් එක්ක. තමන් මොනවද කරන්නේ, කොහෙද ඉන්නේ, කවුද ඇසුරු කරන්නේ, මොන වගේ සමාජ අවකාශයන් එක්කද සම්බන්ධතාව පවත්වන්නේ, කන්නේ මොනවද, දුම් මොනවද, සනීප ආරක්ෂාව, බෙහෙත් ඇතුළු සෞඛ්‍ය මේ සියලු කාරණා වැටපත් එක්ක බද්ධ වෙලා තියෙනවා. විශේෂයෙන්ම සේවිකාවන්ගේ තීරණ ගැනීමේ හැකියාව uncomfortable අකමැති දේවල් වලට විරුද්ධ වීමේ හැකියාව වගේ ජීවිතයට සමීප හැම දෙයක්ම රඳාපවතින තමන්ගේ මූල්‍යමය හැකියාවත් එක්ක. ඒ වගේම සේවිකාවන්ගේ විවාහය හා සහවාසය තුළ ස්වාධීන හා ස්මාර්ට් තීන්දුව ගැනීමේ හැකියාව, ඒ තුළ සිදුවන ප්‍රචණ්ඩත්වයන් හා හිංසනයන්ගෙන් මිදීමේ හැකියාව වගේ ශක්තිය නිර්මාණය වන්නේ ඔවුන් ලබන වැඩුවත් එක්ක. ඒ සියල්ලටම ඔවුන්ගේ ආර්ථික හයිය හැදෙන ජීවත් වීමට සරලම වැටපක් ලැබුණොත් විතරයි. විශේෂයෙන්ම මේ සන්නාම කරුවන්ට ඇති වගකීම අපි මේ තුර සාකච්ඡා කළ යුතුම කරුණක් හැටියට තියෙනවා. ඔවුන්ගේ චර්යා ධර්ම පද්ධති හරහා සෞඛ්‍ය ගැන, පෝෂණය ගැන, සනීප ආරක්ෂාව පිළිබඳ ඇති වෙන කතා කරනවා. අති සරලව අනිත් හැම දෙයක් ගැනම බලනවා, වැටුප් ගැන කතා නොකර. හැබැයි වැටුප් තිබුණා නම් ඒ හැම දෙයක්ම සම්පූර්ණ කරගන්න පුළුවන්. ඇත්තටම ඒක නිසා වෙන බොරු දේවල් කතා කරලා වැඩක් නැහැ. ඩීසන් වැටුපක් ලැබෙනවා නම් විතරයි මේ සේවකයන් සල්බල ගැන්වෙන්නේ. ඇත්තටම ආසියාවට පොදු වැටුපක් සඳහා කලාපීය වශයෙන් සාමූහික උත්සාහයක නියැලෙන්නේ මේ වර්තමානයේ වන විට සේවකයන් ගෙදර ගෙනියන වැටුප ඉතාමත් කම්කාරදායක තත්ත්වයකට පහළ බැහැලා තියෙන නිසා. ඔවුන් අසීමාන්තික කැපවීමක් තුළ දැඩි වෙහෙස වෙලා වැඩ කරලා තදවන විට ඔවුන් උපයන සොච්චම් මුදල් නිසාම සමාජ ආර්ථික සෞඛ්‍යමය ගැටලු රැසකට ඔවුන් මුහුණ දී තියෙනවා. ඒ ඔවුන් වැඩබිම සේවා පරිසරය තුළ මුහුණ දෙන ගැටලු, සමාජ ජීවිතය හා ජීවත් වෙන පරිසරය තුළ මුහුණ දෙන ගැටලු, හා පවුල තුළ මුහුණ දෙන ගැටලු ලෙස ඇත්තටම සරලව වර්ග කර හැකියි. වැඩබිම තුළ ඔවුන්ගේ දෛනික වැටුප ඩොලර් 3කට 4කට සීමා වීම තුළ ගෙදර ගෙනියන වැටුප කීයකින් හරි වැඩි කරගන්න නම් නිෂ්පාදන දිවිමනාව වෙනුවෙන් වැඩ ඉලක්ක ආවරණය කිරීම, ඒ සඳහා කෑම පැය, වැසිකිලි යාමට ගත කරන වේලාව ආදිය කැපකිරීම, වැසිකිලි යාමට කාලය ගත කිරීමට නොහැකි නිසා වතුර බීමෙන් පවා වැළකී ඉන්න උන්ට සිද්ධ වෙනවා. ඒ තුලින් ඔවුන් කායික මානසික වශයෙන් අසීමිත ලෙස පිරිහෙනවා. ඒ වගේම වැඩ ඉලක්ක සපුරා ගැනීමට සුපර්වයිසර්වරයා සමග සුහදශීලීව සිටීම අනිවාර්ය වෙන නිසා පිරිමි සුපර්වයිසර් වරුන් සිටින බොහෝ අවස්ථාවල ඔහුට ලිංගික අල්ලස් ලබා දීමට සිදුවීම, ඔවුන් විසින් සිදු කරන අනෙකුත් කායික, මානසික, වාචික හා ලිංගික හිරිහැරයන් ඉවසීමට සිදුවීම අනිවාර්ය අංගයක් බවට පත් වෙනවා. ඒක නොමැති විට හදිසියකට නිවාඩුවක් ගන්න වෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඉතින් අමාරු ටාගට් හා ඔපරේෂන් වලට උන්ට යන්න සිද්ධ වෙනවා. එක ස්ථානයක වැඩ දෙන්නේ නැහැ. උන්ට ඒ මත ස්ත්‍රී පුරුෂ සමාජභාවය මත විෂමතා ගැටලු අත්වා යමින් ආර්ථික හා ලිංගික ප්‍රචණ්ඩත්වයට ගොදුරු වීමට මේ සේවකයන්ට සිද්ධ වෙනවා. කොවිඩ් තත්ත්වය තුළ මේ වඩා තීව්‍ර වුණා. ඇත්තටම මෙහිදී ඔවුන්ට ලැබෙන මූලික වැටුප ජීවත් වීමට ප්‍රමාණවත් වැටුපක් නේ නම් අතිරේක උපයා ගැනීම වෙනුවෙන් වහල්භාවයකින් යුතුව කටයුතු කිරීමට කිසිසේත්ම ඔවුන්ට සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ නැහැ. එමෙන්න සොච්චම් වැටුපක් සමග ගෙදර යන ඔවුන්ට පවුල තුළ ඇතිවන පිළිගැනීම ඉතා අවම තත්ත්වයක් වෙන හින්දාම ඒ උපයා ගැනීම වෙනුවෙන් අධික කාලයක් මහන්සියක් යොදවන්න වෙනවා. තම නිවස තුළ තමන්ට පැවරෙති කාර්යයන් මග හැරෙනවා මේ හරහා ඒ මුන්දී සිදුවන ප්‍රචණ්ඩත්වය සාම පුරුෂයාගෙන් පවුලේ වැඩිහිටියන්ගෙන් විතරක් නෙමෙයි දරුවන්ගෙන් පවා නිර්මාණය වෙලා ඉවරයි. මේ තුළ උන් කාන්තාවන් නිසාම මුහුණ දිය යුතු වෙනස් කොට දැක්වීම් වලට වාචනය වෙමින් තියෙනවා. ඒක නිසාම මේ ඔවුන් තුළ එකතත්කින් ඔවුන් තුළ ඔවුන් උපයන වැටුපින් සමාජ වගකීම් ඉටු කරන්න නොහැකි වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඒ නිසා සමාජීය වශයෙන් කොම් වෙලා තියෙනවා. එතකොට මේ සියලු කාරණා තුළින් මතුවෙන්නේ ශ්‍රමිකයන්ට ජීවත් වෙන ප්‍රමාණවත් වැටුපක් ලැබෙන්නේ නැත්නම් ඔවුන්ට ස්වාධීනව තීරණය ගැනීමට සමාජ සම්මතයක් අභිමතයක් අතික්‍රමණය කිරීමට ශක්තියක් හා ධෛර්යයක් ලැබෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඒක නිසා අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම මෙතෙන්දී ඉස්මතු වෙලා පේනවා ඔවුන්ට ජීවත් වෙන්න සරලන ප්‍රමාණවත් වැටුපක් ලැබෙනවා නම් ඔවුන්ගේ බොහෝ ප්‍රශ්න විසඳිය හැකි බව සහ ඔවුන් එම්පවර් කිරීමට එක බරපතල විදිහට බලපාන බව.
Thank you, Ashila, for your very important insights. We'll move to our next speaker, Divya now. Divya, you've been leading the Justice for Jayashree campaign and demanding an end to gender-based violence in fashion supply chains. After a 20-year-old member and organizer of your union was brutally murdered by a supervisor from her factory earlier this year. Can you tell us what type of programs and efforts are needed, especially from brands, to end GBVH in fashion supply chains?
Thank you for inviting me to. Join this important discussion today. Jayashree Kadirvel, TTCU member, was brutally murdered by her supervisor from her garment factory earlier on the very first day of this year. Due to large campaign efforts, we were able to win a mutually agreeable compensation for Jayashree's family. We are currently in dialogue with the supplier and the brands sourcing from the factory to bring forth an enforceable agreement to monitor, prevent, and remediate GBVH and barriers to freedom of association in the factory. We are hoping that this agreement can be agreed upon by all parties before the first anniversary of Jayashree in January 2022. Gender-based violence and harassment which result in cases of femicide like that of Jayashree Kadirvel are especially severe in workplaces where the power imbalance is the greatest, such as the garment industry. Existing mechanisms led by brands and suppliers which are top-down and developed without consultations with workers and their trade unions have failed to address all forms of GBVH in the factory floor. The voluntary codes of conduct and social auditing schemes of brands have repeatedly failed to detect and remedy abuses. In audits, workers are interviewed on site in the factory where they usually feel unable to speak candidly about labor conditions, in particular GBVH. The voluntary nature of brands' codes of conduct means that even if instances of GBVH are detected, there is no obligation for the brands to require their suppliers to hold perpetrators accountable. It is in this context that trade unions like TTCU are demanding enforceable brand, supplier, worker agreements to end GBVH in fashion supply chains. We want fashion brands to uphold C190 obligations to end GBVH and other forms of violence in the world of work by negotiating these legally enforceable agreements that cover GBVH and freedom of association in the operations of brands, third-party suppliers. EBAs are necessary as they represent a fundamentally different approach. The brands are obligated to use their economic power to compel adherence by the supplier to strong labor rights standards. We have seen them succeed in the garment factories of Lesotho, and we believe that such agreements offer a huge potential for improving the socio-economic rights of women in the workplace. Also, equally important to highlight is that international labor standards to eliminate GBVH can be implemented successfully only if brands and suppliers work in partnership with women trade union leaders and workers like the Asia Floor Wage Women Leadership Committee. To end GBVH in fashion supply chains, we need to develop and sustain positive organizational cultures on garment production lines co-produced by workers and management to advance the shared goal of preventing GBVH. This requires empowering women workers to have a constructive voice at work, changing problematic supervisory relationships and practices at the level of the production line, and identifying and addressing more covert forms of gendered bullying before they escalate and manifest in more aggressive forms of violence like rape and murder. In other words, preventing GBVH is not only fundamental to the health, safety, and dignity of women workers. It is also fundamental to freedom of association and collective bargaining in industries dominated by women workers. In conclusion, we want brands to replace their voluntary corporate social responsibility programs that have failed to end abuses with legally enforceable obligations and bottom-up training programs like the AFWA Safe Circles strategy, which build women's leadership on production lines to ensure that suppliers respect women workers' rights. Thank you so much for voicing us at this platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Divya, for sharing these important perspectives from your work. I think in this context, it's also important to connect these discussions to the ILO Convention 190 and its provisions. And my final question is to you, Supon. Women trade union leaders, including the AFWA's Women Leadership Committee, fought to win the ILO Convention 190. Which states that all workers have a right to workplaces free from all forms of violence and harassment. How can C190 be used as a guideline for corporate and government responses in addressing the gendered impacts of COVID-19 in fashion supply chains? Go ahead, Sopon.
ជាដំបូងសូមគោរពនិងសូមជម្រាបសួរទៅដល់បងប្អូនទាំងអស់គ្នាដែលជាថ្នាក់ដឹកនាំស្ត្រីដ៏ឆ្នើមដែលកំពុងតែចូលរួមប្រជុំនៅថ្ងៃនេះអរគុណមែនទែនដែលបានអនុញ្ញាតឲ្យខ្ញុំបានធ្វើបទបង្ហាញខ្លីមួយដែលបង្ហាញអំពីសារៈសំខាន់ឬក៏សារៈប្រយោជន៍សម្រាប់នៃអនុសញ្ញា C190 ហ្នឹងបើតាមស្ដាប់វាគ្មិនទាំងអស់បានលើកឡើងនៅខាងដើមយើងឃើញថាបញ្ហាប្រឈមរបស់បងប្អូនកម្មករស្ត្រីនិងកុមារនៅកន្លែងការងារយើងឃើញថាមានច្រើនមែនទែនស្ទើរតែរាប់មិនអស់ហើយវាស្របពេលដែល ខណៈពេលដែល COVID មកបច្ចុប្បន្ននេះស្ថានភាព COVID ទៅទៀតយើងឃើញថាការរំលោភបំពានហ្នឹងរឹតតែមានការរំលោភបំពានយ៉ាងធ្ងន់ធ្ងរបំផុតកន្លែងហ្នឹងខ្ញុំចង់សូមបញ្ចាំងថាតើអនុសញ្ញា C190 នោះមានសារៈសំខាន់សម្រាប់កម្មករនោះដូចមិនដូចពីអ្វីដែលយើងបានមើលឃើញយើងអាចឲ្យនិយមន័យខ្លីមួយថាអនុសញ្ញា C190 ហ្នឹងគឺអាចកែប្រែនៃជីវិតរបស់យើងបានណាទីមួយយើងឃើញថាហិង្សានៅពេលដែលមានការបៀតបៀននៅពិភពការងារអំពីចង់និយាយថាជាអំពើដែលមិនអាចអត់ឱនបានឲ្យបានចង់និយាយថាវាជាអំពើមួយដែលមានការបៀតបៀនហើយជាអំពើមួយដែលយើងមិនអាចអត់ឱនបានអនុសញ្ញានេះស្ដែងចេញជាដំបូងគេដែលផ្ដោតទៅលើការបញ្ឈប់ហិង្សានិងការបៀតបៀននៅក្នុងពិភពការងារមួយទៀតដែរយើងឃើញថាអនុសញ្ញានេះបានកត់សម្គាល់ថាមនុស្សគ្រប់រូបមានសិទ្ធិចូលរួមមានសិទ្ធិរួចផុតពីអំពើហិង្សានិងការបៀតបៀននៅក្នុងពិភពការងារចំណុចមួយទៀតយើងឃើញថាអនុសញ្ញានេះនឹងបំពេញចំណុចខ្វះខាតដែលមាននៅក្នុងបរិបទចង់និយាយថានៅក្នុងមជ្ឈដ្ឋានជាតិណាហើយចំណុចមួយទៀតយើងឃើញថាវាមានវិសាលភាពនៅក្នុងការគ្របដណ្ដប់ទៅលើវិស័យទាំងឯកជនសាធារណៈចក្ខុវិស័យសេដ្ឋកិច្ចក្រៅប្រព័ន្ធនិងទីប្រជុំជនឬក៏ជនបទមួយទៀតដែរយើងឃើញថាអនុសញ្ញានេះវាអាចបញ្ចូលទៅជាលើកដំបូងនៅក្នុងការប្រើហិង្សានៅក្នុងគ្រួសារថាជាផ្នែកមួយនៃផលប៉ះពាល់ដល់ការងារសុខភាពនិងសុវត្ថិភាពរបស់បងប្អូនកម្មករនៅក្នុងនេះយើងអាចធ្វើចង់និយាយថាពីអ្វីដែលយើងបានមើលឃើញតើខ្ញុំមានជាសំណួរមួយថាតើយើងអាចធ្វើអ្វីបានដើម្បីផ្លាស់ប្ដូរឥរិយាបថទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងណាខ្ញុំគិតថាអ្វីដែលយើងអាចយើងទាំងអស់គ្នាអាចនៅក្នុងពិភពការងារយើងឃើញថាវាមានរដ្ឋាភិបាលមានយោជកមានកម្មករមានសហជីពសុទ្ធតែអ្នកមានតួនាទីនៅក្នុងការផ្ដល់ការធានានៅអាចថាសមត្ថភាពការងារជាមួយនឹងផ្ដោតទៅលើការងារជាមួយគ្នាទៅវិញទៅមកនិងសេចក្តីថ្លៃថ្នូររបស់មនុស្សក្នុងនោះខ្ញុំសូមលើកអំពីចំណុចដែលរដ្ឋាភិបាលលោកអាចចង់និយាយថាលោកអាចលោកត្រូវតែធ្វើទីមួយអាចថារដ្ឋាភិបាលត្រូវផ្ដល់សេចក្ដីបានទៅលើអនុសញ្ញាហ្នឹងដើម្បីឲ្យបានឆាប់រហ័សធ្វើឲ្យបន្ទាប់មកធ្វើការផ្សព្វផ្សាយឲ្យបានទូលំទូលាយទៅដល់បងប្អូនប្រជាពលរដ្ឋទាំងអស់គ្នាឲ្យបានដឹងទៅដល់យុវជនឲ្យបានដឹងទីពីរអាចថាក្រសួងនៅពេលដែលចុះអធិការកិច្ចត្រូវតែសួរនាំអំពីការបៀតបៀននៅកន្លែងការងារតើមានស្ថានភាពនៃការបៀតបៀនកើតឡើងនៅកន្លែងការងារដែរឬទេហើយបើមានហ្នឹងគួរតែរៀបចំនីតិវិធីយ៉ាងម៉េចចំណុចមួយទៀតដែរអាចថារដ្ឋាភិបាលត្រូវតែមានគោលនយោបាយមួយឬក៏ដាក់ជាគោលនយោបាយជាក់លាក់មួយនៅក្នុងការបង្ហាត់បង្រៀនទៅដល់ប៉ូលីសទាហានអាជ្ញាធររដ្ឋគ្រប់លំដាប់ថ្នាក់ឲ្យគាត់យល់ដឹងអំពីទម្រង់នៃការបៀតបៀនការទម្រង់នៃការប្រើប្រាស់ហិង្សានិងការបៀតបៀននៅកន្លែងការងារហ្នឹងដើម្បីជួយធ្វើការគ្រប់គ្រងនៅពេលដែលស្ត្រីគាត់មានបញ្ហាកើតឡើងត្រូវផ្ដល់ព័ត៌មានឲ្យចង់និយាយថាកុំឲ្យគាត់មានការភ័យខ្លាចត្រូវទទួលបាននៃការការពារទៅដល់ពួកគាត់ណាចំណុចមួយទៀតដែរយើងឃើញថារដ្ឋាភិបាលគួរតែបានរៀបចំផ្ទះសុវត្ថិភាពមួយសម្រាប់ស្ត្រីនៅពេលដែលស្ត្រីគាត់ហ៊ានចែករំលែកនៅបញ្ហារបស់ពួកគាត់ហើយបើសិនណារដ្ឋាភិបាលលោកមានផ្ទះសុវត្ថិភាពសម្រាប់ស្ត្រីវាធ្វើឲ្យស្ត្រីហ្នឹងអាចចែករំលែកនៅរឿងនៅក្នុងចិត្តរបស់គាត់អស់ហើយគាត់អាចទទួលបានដំណោះស្រាយសម្រាប់គាត់មួយទៀតដែរអាចថារដ្ឋាភិបាលត្រូវអនុម័តទៅលើបញ្ញត្តិច្បាប់ទាំងឡាយសម្រាប់មនុស្សគ្រប់រូបដើម្បីធានាឲ្យបាននៅសិទ្ធិទទួលបាននៅសមភាពគ្មានការរអើងនៅក្នុងការងារនៅមុខរបរការងារចំណុចសំខាន់មួយទៀតដែលខ្ញុំចង់ផ្ដោតទៅលើ brand ឬក៏ហៅថាម្ចាស់ផ្លាកហ្នឹងជាអ្វីដែល brand ហើយម្ចាស់ផ្លាកដែលគាត់ត្រូវតែធ្វើទីមួយក្នុងនាមជាក្នុងករណីដែលមានការដាក់ពាក្យបណ្ដឹងម្ចាស់ផ្លាកត្រូវតែមានការគ្រប់គ្រងទៅលើសេវាផ្នែកច្បាប់ដូចជាមេធាវីក្នុងករណីដែលកម្មករត្រូវការមេធាវីក្នុងការដំណើររឿងនៃវិវាទរបស់គាត់មួយទៀតដែរអាចថាក្នុងកំឡុងពេលស្ថានភាពនៃ COVID ម្ចាស់ផ្លាកទាំងអស់ដែលយើងមើលឃើញគឺគាត់សង្ងំនៅក្នុងការយកថារកផលចំណេញមិនមើលឃើញអំពីកម្មករដែលគាត់កំពុងរងទុក្ខសប្តាហ៍ថ្ងៃនេះគឺពាក់ព័ន្ធជាមួយការជិះឡានជំទាវ ការញ៉ាំអាហារជុំគ្នានៅកន្លែងការងារហ្នឹងគ្មានសុវត្ថិភាពគ្មានសុខចង់និយាយថាគ្មានសុវត្ថិភាពសម្រាប់គាត់ហើយបញ្ជាការរីករាលដាលនៃជំងឺCOVID-19 អីផ្សេងៗហ្នឹងយើងឃើញថាម្ចាស់ផ្នែកហាក់ដូចជាបង្ងើយកតោយមិនមានការចិត្តដាក់ទៅលើពួកគាត់ពាក់ព័ន្ធមួយចំណុចហ្នឹងទេចំណុចមួយទៀតអាចនិយាយថាម្ចាស់ផ្នែកតែងតែនិយាយដោយពាក្យថាខ្លួនអនុលោមទៅតាមច្បាប់ដោយមិនដោយកេងចំណេញអំពីស្ថានភាពប្រទេសមួយដែលមិនមានប្រជាធិបតេយ្យកម្មករពិបាកនៅក្នុងការចងក្រងបង្កើតសហជីពអនុវត្តសិទ្ធិជាមូលដ្ឋានរបស់កម្មករនិយោជិតនៅកន្លែងការងារនៅពេលដែលកម្មករជួបនៅឧបសគ្គក្នុងការបង្កើតសហជីពទម្រង់នៃអំពើហិង្សានៃការបៀតបៀនមានការកើតឡើងដោយមានកិច្ចអន្តរាគមន៍ពីតំណាងកម្មករយន្តការក្នុងការដោះស្រាយកម្មករនៅកន្លែងការងារក៏ដូចក៏នៅតែបន្តឆ្លើយតបស្ថានភាពរបស់កម្មករនោះឡើយចំណុចចុងក្រោយជាសំណុំពរអាចថាវាជាចំណុចដែលជាការលើកឡើងរបស់ខ្ញុំក្នុងនាមខ្ញុំជាប្រធានសហជីពនៅសហព័ន្ធអាជីពកម្ពុជាហើយកតកាទូហ្នឹងខ្ញុំសំណុំពរទៅដល់ម្ចាស់ផ្លាក brand ហើយតែ brand ហ្នឹងត្រូវតែធានាថាការអនុវត្តរបស់ខ្លួនមិនបង្កើតឲ្យមានលក្ខខណ្ឌនៃអំពើហិង្សាផ្អែកទៅលើសេដ្ឋកិច្ចដែលរំលោភទៅលើសិទ្ធិកម្មករជាស្ត្រីនៅក្នុងការឈានទៅរកការងារប្រកបដោយសុវត្ថិភាពសេចក្តីថ្លៃថ្នូរលក្ខខណ្ឌការងាររបស់កម្មករសមរម្យការសម្រេចបាននៅកន្លែងការងារដែលគ្មានអំពើហិង្សាតម្រូវឲ្យម្ចាស់ផ្លាកយីហោ brand ធ្វើការជាមួយសហជីពនិងអ្នកដឹកនាំជាស្ត្រីរបស់ពួកគេនៅក្នុងរោងចក្រថ្នាក់ជាតិនៅថ្នាក់តំបន់ដើម្បីកំណត់និងដំណោះស្រាយវិសាលភាពជាក់លាក់នៃអំពើហិង្សាកត្តាហានិភ័យដែលពាក់ព័ន្ធដែលភ្ជាប់មកជាមួយនៃការអនុវត្តការបញ្ជាទិញចំណុចមួយទៀតដែរជាការអនុវត្តដែលនយោជកត្រូវតែមានការអនុវត្តហ្នឹងគឺយើងបានលើកឡើងមាន3 4 5 6 7ចំណុចក្នុងហ្នឹងយើងគិតថាចំណុចទី1គឺពាក់ព័ន្ធvớiការបញ្ឈប់ការប្រើប្រាស់នៃកិច្ចសន្យាការងារខ្លីគឺជាឧបសគ្គរារាំងធំនៅក្នុងការអនុវត្តសិទ្ធិសហជីពនិងការចរចាជាសមរភាពរបស់កម្មករជាពិសេសនៅក្នុងទម្រង់អំពើហិង្សានៅក្នុងទម្រង់ទាំង4នៅខាងលើនយោជកត្រូវតែមានប្រអប់សម្បត្តិដើម្បីឲ្យស្ត្រីដាក់នៅបញ្ហារបស់គាត់ហើយត្រូវធ្វើការឆ្លើយតបស៊ើបអង្កេតដោយការពារសុវត្ថិភាពជូនដល់អ្នកដែលបានដាក់ពាក្យបណ្ដឹងនោះស្នើសុំឲ្យនយោជកបង្កើតជំរុញឲ្យមានបង្កើតគណៈកម្មការស្ត្រីនៅក្នុងរោងចក្រដើម្បីដោះស្រាយបញ្ហារបស់ស្ត្រីបន្តមកទៀតអាចថាមានវគ្គបណ្ដុះបណ្ដាលអំពីអំពើហិង្សានៃការបៀតបៀននៅក្នុងពិភពការងារហ្នឹងគ្រប់អាចថាក្នុងបរិបទសម្រាប់អ្នកគ្រប់គ្រងដើម្បីជៀសផុតអំពើហិង្សាមានការបិទជាពាក្យស្លោកឬក៏
Thank you Soporn. I think the time is up. Really sorry to cut you off. Thanks a lot though. I'd like to thank all panelists for this very important discussion. What we have really seen today is that a wide range of programs exist to address GBVH in fashion supply chains, but they have failed and GBVH continues to exist even now. This is because these programs are often top-down or rely on voluntary social auditing measures, both of which do not recognize the central role played by women workers and their trade unions in addressing GBVH. Another issue that these approaches have is their unwillingness to recognize the links between economic harm within fashion supply chains and the GBVH faced by women workers, not only in the factory, but in their homes and communities as well. This is what makes the ILO C-190 an important policy measure, as it brings an understanding of the link between the world of work and violence faced by women across different spaces, not restricted to the factory, because it recognizes economic violence as a form of GBVH. The solutions discussed in the panel today point to the need for ground-up solutions that stress on the collective power of women workers, their right to freedom of association, and their leadership development in order to institute mechanisms that are led, designed, and implemented by workers themselves to resolve these issues. This is also in line with what AFWA's Women Leadership Committee resolves to achieve through building the leadership of women workers to take on a wide range of important issues, such as the right to a living wage, the right to freedom of association, which are critical rights without which GBVH in fashion supply chains cannot be addressed. The WLC has also been working on the Safe Circle approach, which focuses on building the power of women to address GBVH in their production lines through their collective strength. With that, I conclude this panel. Thank you all very much, and over to you, Vishmi.
Thank you very much, Nivedita, for moderating the panel. And thank you to our distinguished speakers who voiced their opinions and views on how we can move forward in addressing gender-based violence and harassment in global supply chains. Now, as we come to the end of this report launch on how the practices of fashion brands have perpetrated violence within the factories and beyond, I would like to invite Asia Flowage Alliance's Ashley Saxby to share with us her concluding remarks following the ideas and perspectives that have been discussed today in light of the report launch.
Thanks, Vishmi. All right. Okay, so with this, we come to the conclusion of this report launch. And to wrap up, we would like to highlight that the pandemic has laid bare the structural inequalities within global fashion supply chains that are perpetuated and reinforced by the business models and purchasing practices of fashion brands. And while GBVH has always been endemic to the industry, the report reveals to us how the crisis created by the pandemic brought out the very worst in brands. And while they minimized reduction in their profits and recovered their businesses, garment workers in Asia, who are predominantly women, continue to reel from the long-term impacts of the crisis as they subsidize brands by absorbing the economic shocks of the pandemic, not only in the form of wage theft, but also through reproduction of the workforce. And this came at great personal cost, while having to bear the interrelated gendered forms of violence on production lines. But this was not just confined within the factory walls, but the actions of brands had far-reaching repercussions on women's experiences of violence and harassment within their families and communities as well. The report and discussions today have focused on an important yet under-discussed phenomenon: how labor rights violations within supply chains intersect with gender-based violence and harassment. And this is particularly an important lens to understand an industry that has a preference for hiring women workers from marginalized socioeconomic backgrounds, precisely because there are barriers to their ability to demand protection and rights. However, it's also important to acknowledge that while the pandemic has led to a humanitarian crisis for women workers, it has also provided the opportunity to highlight the lack of responses to the structural features of fashion supply chains that rely on GBVH as an intrinsic mechanism to discipline workers and increase profits for lead firms. The evidence, analysis, and solutions presented in the report, as well as in the discussions today, show us the immense strength of women workers and women leaders in the Asian labor movement to call out GBVH in supply chains despite all odds. It has lent strength and urgency to their voices and demands to establish strong labor market institutions within global supply chains that place women workers and their organizations at the center. It has made the need for ground-up solutions to GBVH that are designed and implemented by women workers an imperative to a just recovery from the pandemic. We have continued to fight for change on all fronts during these trying times. Trade unions are engaging in litigation and policy advocacy to hold brands liable for the economic harm faced by women workers during the pandemic. The Justice for J3 campaign is demanding an enforceable agreement to end GBVH. Women leaders have developed an important safe circle strategy that leads to worker implemented and monitored systems to address GBVH at the factory floor. And these are a few among many, many efforts. So we hope today's discussion will lend strength to these important efforts to make fashion supply chains free of gender-based violence and harassment. Thank you very much. Back to you, Vishmi.
Thank you, Ashley. So we have come to the end of the Asia Flowage Alliance's report launch today. And I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who played a role in today's report launch. Thank you very much to the panelists and moderators who shared important insights to the violence and harassment prevalent in supply chains across countries. A big thank you to the translators for providing us with simultaneous translations. This would not have been a success without you all. Also, I would like to thank the Asia Flowage Alliance team for organizing and making this event a success. Finally, thank you very much to everyone who joined us today to witness this report launch. Your support in our endeavors is our greatest strength. Thank you to everyone once again. Good day and good night to you all. Thank you.
Goodbye.
បាទអរគុណ
អរគុណ
ច្រើន
បងឯង
Thank you
ចាអរ
everyone
គុណច្រើន